A fantastic story, by the way. Really, really good. I thought that was really, really good. Do you have any money on you right now? Oh, okay, good. All right, cool. Awesome. Well, it's good to have you all here. Want to make a couple of announcements before we get into the sermon. First of all, on July 24th, the youth group is, the teens are taking a trip to Holiday World, but it's not just a youth trip. They're going to buy tickets for anybody who wants to go. You can get the discount for Holiday World. There'll be a lot of church people there that day. So if you'll sign up on the website or pay by July 23rd, you can get you a really good price on your tickets that way. So July 24th coming up pretty soon. Then second, in the back of the room, in the back corner there's a sign, a big everyone sign, and we started it last September at our fall kickoff. And we challenged people to, over the next year, think about sharing your faith with somebody. You know, let somebody know what it is that you believe and what you stand for. To either share your testimony or invite them to church, or because the gospel is for everyone. And we've had that up for almost a year, and it's about to go away. And so I just want to challenge you here, as in the last few weeks that we have the sign, to again think about sharing your faith with somebody. Come back there, turn one of those bulbs a little bit to the right, and light it up. That when I up here preach, I can see it back there in the back, and it lets me know. I mean, it's a encouragement to me, because I know a lot of people have tried to share their faith this year, and that's exciting. So I wanted to let you know about that as well. A couple of weeks ago, in the New York Times, the Surgeon General of the United States wrote an editorial. And he said in the editorial that he thinks that social media, Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and those kinds of companies, Snapchat, that they should come with some sort of a warning label like we put on cigarettes. And his motivation for that is, and I'm quoting him here, he says, there's significant mental health harms for adolescents that come from social media. He believed, the Surgeon General, that social media companies target teenagers really in a lot of the same way that cigarette companies did, and that there's an addictive quality to it, and it's hard to break free of, and that we, as a government, he says, needs to let people know about that. In the editorial, he said that any person who spends more than 3 hours a day on social media is more than twice as likely to have anxiety or depression symptoms. Which seems like a lot of hours, 3 hours. But in the same editorial, he says the average teenager spends 4.8 hours a day on social media, which just seems extraordinary to me. And maybe there's a kid out here today, so I only spend like a half an hour. Well, that means there's some other kid, to get the average there, if he's right, that's spending 9 or 10 hours a day on social media, which just seems remarkable to me and crazy and nutty, but it does illustrate, right, that there's a problem. I mean, if we're seeing that kind of and I can just tell you from working at church camp, and I've when I came back in 2008, I started helping at Wonder Valley Camp with the high schoolers, and just in the 15 or 16 years that I've been helping at the church camp, I can tell you that the rise of anxiety and depression symptoms in our teenagers is noticeable. I mean, just in 15 years. You don't have to go back 20 generations. I mean, just in less than one generation, you can see a giant difference. And how many kids are coming to the camp and saying that they can't participate in some of the activities because they have anxiety or they have depression, or that they need special attention or special medicines because they have anxiety or they have depression. It's a common thing. And it's something that at church camp, dealing with high schoolers, we have to deal with all the time in a way that we would not have had to 15 years ago and didn't even talk about when I was a kid. Even the song we just sang, which I had several people tell me after they did it last week, hey, bring that one back. That was a great song. I had 2 or 3 tell me that. Even that song we just sang about speaking Jesus, there's a line in there about how he'll end anxiety and depression. That's just hard to imagine somebody who wrote one of the old hymns even including a line like that in the hymn. It's just such a problem today in a way that it wasn't then. And so you think to yourself, well, maybe the Surgeon General's onto something there. Maybe that's been the thing, you know. There's been a rise of social media there, and maybe that's the deal. And as you can imagine, there were people who agreed with him, who commented to the New York Times, or you can find other articles online, who said, yeah, exactly right, we need to fix that. That's been the whole problem all this time. But there were other people who came in who went a different direction. They said, no, this is just one more, I remember I read one guy who said, it's just one more Christian hoax. And you can get offended by that, but if you've been in church as long as I have, you know there have been some Christian hoaxes down through the years. Well, when I was in youth group, they would tell you if you played your Led Zeppelin albums backwards, you could hear Satan's voice in it. And people would do that, try to hear, if they could hear some little, you hear that? You hear that? And then I couldn't hear anything. And there were whole conferences devoted to a study of that. I have, since I've been into ministry, I've seen different people say that video games are going to be the death of all of us, or certain kinds of movies, or certain kinds of music, and it seems like we keep getting by it. And I could see why somebody would say, well, social media is just the latest boogeyman. People are pointing to that, and they're saying, well, there you go. It's just one of those Christian scams. And I would have just a couple of objections to that. The first objection is I don't know whether the Surgeon General is a Christian or not, but I'm confident he wasn't proposing it from a Christian perspective. I'm sure that wasn't what he was doing. He sees an epidemic. He thinks this could be a source. And I think parents and people should pay attention to that. You know, even if you are somebody who struggles with anxiety or depression and you can see that you spend a lot of time on social media, I think it'd be worth a try to back off of that a little bit and see if that helps. I don't think he was writing from a Christian perspective, more as a concerned citizen. That's the first objection. But then the second objection that I have to the idea of saying it's a Christian hoax, and maybe it's a church, maybe the church has fallen for that sort of thing at different times, but it's biblically, the problem is very rarely the inputs that are coming in, but how we respond to those inputs and whether we let those inputs have a place in our heart. For example, when I first became a Christian, there was a big boycott against Walden Books. I don't know if anybody remembers that or not, but a lot of churches were encouraged to boycott Walden Books, which at the time was one of the 2 or 3 biggest booksellers in the country, because they had started to sell Playboy magazines and Penthouse magazines in their stores. So there was a big call to boycott Walden Books, and we're going to stop pornography. And it bankrupted Walden Books. There's no more of those. How's pornography doing? Right? The problem was never a supply issue. It was always a demand issue, right? And biblically, that would be the issue. I mean, the world is going to do what the world does, and we're cautioned to be careful about the world, but the problem always was our hearts and how we hunger to be influenced by things that aren't really that healthy for us. How we take other things and we worship those things or make those things center of our lives as opposed to God. And social media is just the latest in a long line of things that tries to take that spot in your heart. I don't think most people realize how much they're influenced every day, how many intelligent people are working very hard to get you to look one direction or another. Social media certainly is part of that, but there's a whole industry of people who are influencers on social media who try to present this perfect life, you know, whether it's a fitness life and they're just working out all the time and eating certain foods, or it's a traditional wife. There's a whole genre of that where some lady will have, she's in a perfect iron dress there in Montana raising chickens, and you could be like me, and people will follow that to see, oh, how did she look? She's making apple pie with her hands. It's all homemade. Isn't that awesome? We could do that later this afternoon. And there's a whole genre of that. There's a whole genre of guys playing video games. And people will watch. People won't play video games, but they'll watch another guy play video games and maybe pick up tips or hear him be funny while he's on it. And you just have no idea with the social media how many different ways it gets its hooks into you. But that's not it, of course. I mean, the political stuff that goes on. We're told by both parties that if the other guy gets elected, it'll be the end of democracy, the end of civilization, the end of whatever, and people believe that. They do. Every election, we're told this is the most important election, and people believe that, and they get all turned upside down and inside out by it, and you don't realize how much you're influenced by things. And that's not even counting the thousands and thousands and thousands of advertisements that you see every day that are telling you with just a little bit of a different a car or clothes or hair product that your whole life could be different. If you could just add this one thing to your life, you'd be as happy as the people in the cigarette ad. And so you think to yourself, well, maybe that's what I'm missing. And nobody consciously thinks that. I mean, advertisers know that. You're not going to see an ad of of skinny people drinking beer and say, hey, I should drink beer and be skinny too. You're not going to do that, right? But it's a subtle thing, and it adds up. You just start, it just collects. There's a reason why companies spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on these advertisements, because they know that we will bite. Maybe not on the first or the second or the 10th, but we'll bite. The problem was never demand. It was always supply. We have hungry hearts. Bruce Springsteen said that. And those hungry hearts that we have a way of taking us in directions that we don't want to go. So this sermon's kind of a standalone sermon. It doesn't really relate to anything before it or afterward. It was something I've been thinking about for a few weeks, and I wanted to share. I wanted to talk about what is your big influence? What's the big thing that hooks you? And as a spoiler, kind of, for the end of the sermon, to tell you kind of where I'm going, I hope that it's Jesus. When I read about Jesus in the Bible, beyond the heaven and hell stuff, beyond that, if we could just take that off the table as part of the package, I'm just struck by the quality of Jesus' life. I'm struck by how he handles relationships and friendships, how he handles people who are angry with him. I'm struck by how he manages conflict. I'm struck by his vision for the world, where everybody's lifting everybody else up, and people have value, and there's peace, and there's joy, and there's purpose, and I'm struck by that. And the more I reflect and I think on Jesus, the more I want him to be my main influence. I want Jesus to be an influence for me much more than some lady in Montana with a perfectly ironed dress, or by somebody in the advertisement, or by some politician. I mean, I want Jesus to be my central and primary influence. And I'm not the first guy to feel like that. I mean, people who have become disciples of Jesus all through the ages, that's always the defining call of their life. Dallas Willard said, there is no problem in modern life that apprenticeship to Jesus will not solve. And I believe that. I think that's absolutely 100% true. There is no problem in modern life that apprenticeship to Jesus won't solve. And so that's where I'm hoping I can take you before we're done with this thing. But I want to think about the influence deal and what influences you. Now, Paul, the Apostle Paul, way back in the Jesus era, in the first century, he was a guy thinking through those kinds of questions and thinking through what it means to be, what do you base your life on, and what do you make the center part of your life? What leads you, what guides you and influences you? And he has a long section about it in Philippians. He writes this church in Philippi, and he's trying to encourage them to think certain ways. And he says, finally, or further, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. You know, make God your center focus. It's no trouble, he says, for me to write this to you again, and it's a safeguard for you. And he says, but you need to be careful. You need to watch out. You need to beware. He says, there's people who are going to try to creep in and steal your freedom. Now, in his case, in Paul's case, and talking to these Philippians, it wasn't an Instagram influencer. It was people who were coming in to say, if you really want to follow God, then you've got to go this super religious route. And he calls them dogs and evildoers. They would not have thought of themselves that way, but they're pushing the Philippians to take the Old Testament rules, the ritual rules like circumcision, and apply them to their life. That's why he calls them mutilators of the flesh. That's the circumcision thing. He's encouraging people, if you want to be Christian, you need to do the Jewish rules first, and then you can be Christian. And Paul's saying they're adding stuff to the gospel. He says you need to watch out for them. They're trying to make you think if you'll just do what they do, then you'll be right. And you don't need to look to them. You don't need to look to anybody. Just look to Jesus. That's his point, the whole thing. He goes on with this, though. He says, we're the circumcision, which is kind of an odd way to say it, but we're the ones who are separated and cut apart. We're the ones who serve God in the Spirit. We're the ones who boast in Christ Jesus. We don't put confidence in the flesh. And let me pause right there. We don't brag about the outside stuff. Flesh is kind of a complicated word in the Greek, and it's a hard word to translate into the English to get all the nuances out of it. In English, we have words like that too. ball. Ball is a word like that. You play with a ball. You could go have a ball with a ball, right? You could have a ball with a ball at the ball, right? It's the same word, but it means something different depending on the context. And when you hear it, you know immediately what I'm saying, even though I'm using the same word over and over again. Well, flesh is kind of that word. It means more than one thing. It means your muscle and your body and the physical, right? But it also means the part of you, the animal part of you that's not got God attached to it at all. It's you without any spiritual thought or idea. And Paul says we don't put confidence in either of those ideas. We don't brag about how we look and how we sound and how we act. We don't brag about all the different things we pursue outside of God. We don't put confidence in that. And again, when I was reading this, I thought about all those influencers who want you to put confidence in your strength or in your beauty or in your wealth. And all those different things are tempting, and all those different things can give a thrill there for a little while. But Paul says as Christians, we don't put confidence in that kind of stuff. We know that kind of stuff is not going to take us where we want to go. And some of it can be pretty appealing. You know, wealth, I guess in particular, can open a lot of doors. A person who looks a certain way can open a lot of doors. I understand the hook of trying to chase after all those different things, but Paul says we don't put confidence there. And then he goes on, but I could. And so remember, the people who are challenging Paul's viewpoint are people who are saying you got to be Jewish first, then you can be Christian. You got to do all the Old Testament rules first, then you can do the New Testament. And Paul says, I could play that game. And then he starts listing it. So if anybody thinks they've got reason to put confidence in their flesh, I've got some reasons. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day, a people of Israel, a Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, I was a Pharisee. The Pharisees were, there's only 6,000 at any one time, and the Pharisees dedicated themselves to obeying every possible law. They just were relentless to one another. And there were certain sects of the Pharisees, sects, C-S-E-C-T-S, certain sects, I can't say it right, sects of the Pharisees who would even put other rules that the Bible didn't require. There was one group of Pharisees, John Ortberg talks about them, that were called the black and blue Pharisees because they felt like you shouldn't even look at a woman, so avoid temptation. So if anytime a woman came, they would close their eyes. They were constantly running into things, so they were called the black and blue Pharisees. I'm not even sure if it's true, but I've heard Ortberg say it in 2 or 3 sermons, and it sounds true. It's got a certain truthiness to it. I don't know that it is true, but it sounds like it could be true, because Pharisees did that sort of thing. And Paul says, I was like that. And as for zeal, I attacked the church. And as for righteousness, that you could see based on law, you couldn't hold anything against me. And Paul's not saying here that he's never made a sin in his whole life. He's not saying that. He's just saying, when I sinned, I made the appropriate sacrifices. I did whatever I had to do to get it right on my side again. As far as the law is concerned, I'm righteous. You couldn't find anything on me at all. But, and this is the most important verse in the whole section, but whatever was a gain to me, I now consider a loss for the sake of Christ. Paul said, I look at all those things that I had that were advantages, all the different things that filled me with pride. And all that pride did was made me not want to think about God. All that pride did was keep God at a distance. And so whatever was a gain to me, I now consider a loss. Some of the things that Paul was bragging about weren't necessarily wrong in and of themselves, right? He was privileged, to use modern language. He was born in the right tribe, to the right people. Certain people in here, might be considered privileged, depending on your political view. Paul doesn't apologize for that. But even those privileges, he says, that I had, they didn't take me where I wanted to go. And then all the different things that he did. I worked so hard to manage everything. I worked so hard to be in control of everything. And all it did was make me proud that I was managing everything. And all those things that made me so proud, he says, I just see now that it kept me from Jesus. So those gains, he says, were really losses. He goes on. He says, what's more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I've lost all things. Paul reduces it all to, I just want to know Jesus. I want him to be the main influence and influencer in my life. Charles Spurgeon says that Paul was really good at spiritual arithmetic. For years and years and years, he would try to do all these good things so that God would do good for him. And you may not think that you do that, but most Christians do. Most people do, if we're being honest. You try to be a good person, or at least nobody thinks they're bad. Everybody tries to be a good person or do things that you think are worth doing. And then if something bad happens to you, it's tempting to look at God and say, wait a minute, God, after all I've done for you? Hold on just a second. I thought we had a deal. I would manage my part, then you'd manage your part. And it can be quite disappointing when you find out that all of your good stuff didn't make you any more Superman-ish than not doing it. That was never what he called you to. Paul says, I aspire to know Jesus. Jesus went through hard times, but it didn't crush him. Jesus was struck by hard things, but it didn't break him. I want that kind of spirit. I want to know Jesus. I want to have his joy and his peace and his love and his compassion. I want to think like him. And if I can have that, Paul says, all the rest of it I'm willing to trade in. There's a parable Jesus tells about a man who goes to a market and finds a pearl of great price. And he says, I'll give you everything I have for it. And he walks away in joy because of the great deal he just made. It's no sacrifice at all to give everything away if I get this back. It's like playing Let's Make a Deal. Or, it's no big deal to trade in a bunch of treasures if the treasure you get at the end is better. Paul continues this thought. He says, I consider it garbage, all those other things. And actually the word he uses is a rougher word. It's the modern equivalent would be BS. And if you're a child here, your parent can explain that to you later on. But BS was what that's the word he uses. And I just consider it BS. He says that I could find Christ, gain Christ and be found in him, a righteousness of my own which comes not from the law, but through faith in Christ. A righteousness that comes from God. It's on the basis of faith. It's what he does for me, not what I do. He says, all that other stuff just kept me away from him. He says, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of his resurrection and participate in his sufferings and become like him in his death and somehow attain to the resurrection of the dead. All those clauses there are important. And bear with me here as I just go through them all. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. We spent last week at camp talking about there's nobody in the grave. Because there was nobody in the grave, everybody has hope. Because Jesus came back out of that grave, it validates every other thing he said. Because Jesus came out of that grave, it proves that the cross was not an accident, but on purpose. It proves that when he says he's going to pay for our sin, he really did pay for our sin. It proves that God loves you so much that he would rather die than live without you. The resurrection proves all those things. The power of the resurrection is the knowledge that God is on your side. And you don't have to try to impress God. He's already impressed with you enough to give everything away. We talk about those trades again. The pearl of great price. You were God's pearl of great price. And he sacrificed everything to bring you back. He says, I want to participate in his sufferings. Jesus was willing to push others forward, even at cost to himself. If in helping you get to where you've got to go, I have to lose, that was a trade Jesus was willing to make. And again, it goes with his mindset, right? You're the pearl of great price to Christ. You're worth giving everything for. And he lived that. And Paul says, I want to be that kind of person. I want to be that way with my family. I want to be that way with my friends. I want to be that way with my neighbors, with my countrymen, with my enemies. Paul says, I'm willing to participate in his sufferings if that means I'm pushing forward his agenda. I'll become like him in his death, Paul says. Jesus sacrificed everything for us, and Paul says, if that's what it takes to really know Jesus, then I'm willing to go wherever that goes, because I believe, he says, that he's going to bring me back. The same way that he came out of the grave, he's going to bring me back out of the grave too. Paul says it's a trade that I'm willing to make. In Jesus' most famous story, and I've talked about it before in sermons, it's my favorite story by Jesus. A man has two sons. And the two sons go different directions. The younger son says he wants to go live his life without dad telling him anything. So dad gives him his inheritance early, and the younger son goes and wastes it on parties. He drinks and he sleeps around, and he just wastes all of it. And there are people who think that's the way to live life. You can go on social media and find people who will espouse that kind of worldview. But you can find it in advertisements and different celebrities. They'll say the secret is to just get all you can out of life. Take as many great vacations and spend as much money and go to all the great places you can. Don't let anybody tell you what to do. The secret of life is to be your own man, be your own woman, do whatever you want. And the prodigal son is kind of the patron saint for people who choose that kind of life. And I've always seen that in the story. I never missed that part. It always made sense to me. I saw that. And eventually the younger son comes to a place where all his money's gone, and then all his friends are gone, and then he's hungry. And he says, well, I could at least eat back with dad. And so he goes back to his father, and his father runs to him. He loves him, and he's so glad he's back. It's all forgiven. And it's supposed to be a picture of how God does with us, right? That even when we have turned away from God at every turn and lived our own life and done our own thing, that God will still take us back because he loves us. And it's no great sacrifice for God to do it because he loves us. I've always got that part out of the story. But there's more to the story. And I was reading this book by Tim Keller, and he talks about this element of it, and it's powerful. See, there's another son, an older son, and he never left. He stayed right there. And he's been in the farm, and he's been working. And he's been working, and he's been working. He never takes a day off. Never vacations. Never even has a little party with his friends. Just nose to the grindstone all the time. And when the father brings the younger son back in, the older son's ticked off about it. Wait a minute. Why have I been working this way then? And what Keller says in his book is this is the second way to live life. The first way to live life, and a lot of people go this way, is they say, what I want is to get as much as I can. I'm not going to listen to anybody. I'm going to do my own thing. Nobody can tell me what to do. I'm going to do whatever I want. That's one way to live life. And people choose that. But a lot of people choose the other way, the older son way. I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to work so hard to be a good person. I'm going to do good things. I'm going to hang out with good people. I'm going to devote myself and martyr myself to good stuff. And then one day God does something you don't understand. And you're so ticked off. I've been slaving for you for years. I've never even taken a break. How could you do this to me? And the story with the two sons is that both sons are lost. I never got that before. When I heard the story, I never caught that part. They're both lost. It's easy to see with the prodigal why he's lost, but the older son's lost too, and the father has to go out to both of them because he loves them. There's a lot of people, maybe even in here, who have tried the prodigal life. And if you're here, you found at least part of that to be empty. But there's a lot of people in here who have taken the older brother life. And it may not have occurred to you yet that this way is just as empty. It's just Jesus. He loves us. You don't have to prove anything to Jesus. You don't have to impress Jesus with how smart you are or how strong you are or how good you are. Some of us work so hard not to impress God, but to impress the people around us with how serious we are. And that's where the influencers come in. We work so hard to have just the right products, all the right brands, to go on the right vacations and make sure we post them on the right social media feeds, to impress people and be good. And it's empty. And the Father loves you. And so there's a call Jesus makes in Matthew 11. He says, to all who are weary and heavy burdened, come to me, and you'll find rest. Rest for your souls. He says, my yoke is easy. My burden is light. Just follow after me. And know that I love you. Know that everybody has hope because nobody's in the grave. Know that there's no problem in human life that apprenticeship to Jesus Christ cannot solve. And fall in love with Jesus again. So here's my challenge here at the end of the day. For people on either camp, the people who have tried to find their hope and their peace through money or through success or through fame or through how well they're in shape or through whatever else it is. If you find that to be empty, can I challenge you to come back to Jesus? He loves you, and he'll carry you. I also want to challenge all the good Christian folks who are trying so hard to manage every part of it, who are so mortifyingly embarrassed when their kid does something stupid because you're afraid it's going to make you look bad. For that crowd, Jesus loves you. You don't have to impress anybody. He gave everything for you. All you got to do is cry out for him. And I still believe, for all the people in here, that the thing that makes life make the most sense is just to know him and make him the biggest influence in your life. And that's my challenge to you today. Let me pray for you.